Hey guys, welcome to day 2 of one of my favorite weeks of the year, Scholastic Journalism Week. This week is all about celebrating what you do in your classroom every day. The Journalism Education Association, or JEA, puts out a different discussion question for each day of the week. Today's is, how important are new voices laws in your state, and have you been censored at your school? I thought today's topic was perfect for a video because it's something that is really near and dear to my heart. If you're new here, my name is Katie Moreno and I'm the founder of Organized Advisor. I was a high school journalism teacher for about 6 years in Houston, Texas, and censorship from an administrator is the direct reason why I'm not teaching anymore. I thought I'd share my story because Texas doesn't have a new voices law yet, and it really demonstrates exactly why new voices legislation is so important. To give you some background, this happened in the 2018-2019 school year, so it's been a couple of years, but it's still really important to talk about because Texas still doesn't have new voices legislation and only 14 states do. So this type of situation shouldn't have happened, and new voices legislation would have prevented it from escalating to the point that it did and possibly preventing it at all. So at my school, we did have what's called prior review. So before we got the school newspaper printed, I had to bring the entire issue to the principals for them to approve it. In that process, they pulled several articles throughout the year and then started to also censor the yearbook. The first, early in the school year, we had a student tragically pass away from an accident and the community was hosting a memorial. Unfortunately, this had also happened in the past several times, and it was very normal for my students to go and from a respectful distance take a picture of the candlelight vigil. They wrote an article in the school newspaper just stating that this is what happened and this was the event that took place. I tried to explain the intention that my students had in wanting to report on the event and showed her the precedent, but wanting to be respectful and also build a new relationship with my new principal, I said, that's fine, we won't report on it, no big deal. I apologized because it seemed like my students were overstepping or being inappropriate, and that was not their intention, and moved on. A few weeks later, my students wanted to write an article about the pink tax, which is basically just that women's hygiene products are more expensive than men's, and is that true? Is it a myth? And get students' opinions on it. In my opinion, it was a pretty safe topic. It was pretty vanilla. It wasn't controversial. It was well reported, and administrations pulled that saying that it wasn't appropriate for teenage audiences. After that, things got a lot more intense. In the yearbook, we had space to cover all student clubs, whether they're curriculum-based or non-curriculum-based. We had a group photo as well as a space to cover them with some sort of mod or secondary coverage. For the Pride Club, which is basically the Gay Straight Alliance, the administration requested that whoever was identified in the yearbook as part of that club get a parent permission slip to do so. I did express reservations about this because no other group was required to have parent permission slips. The club was approved on campus, and our district had what's called privacy codes, and the policy expressly says that if they're in a student club, they can be identified in the yearbook as such, as long as their privacy code allows. And it's further marginalizing an already marginalized group. So although I did express reservations, ultimately it was her decision, and again, wanting to respect her decision, and because we had already had a little tension, I drafted a permission slip and took it to the club sponsor, explained what it was, and told her to give it to her students and then have them bring it back to me. The club sponsor also had reservations and went to go speak to the principal on her own. After they met, I was called in to speak with the administrator, who charged me with insubordination for not following a directive. I stated that I handled the situation how I would with any other club. It is the club sponsor's responsibility to handle communication between the students and the yearbook. I explained that I was not intending to go against the directive. I even drafted the permission slip, but as I understand it, it is within my role as a journalism advisor to advocate for student press rights. And if the students wanted to cover the Pride Club, that they should be able to do so without censorship. Then the decision was to remove all non-curriculum clubs from the yearbook, which of course the student editors were very upset about. After many discussions with them, she ended up agreeing that they can be in the yearbook with a group photo, but no additional coverage such as a module or a feature. At this point in the school year, I was obviously really uncomfortable with my relationship with this administrator, but I still had prior review and I still had to do my job. And so obviously every time we had a new edition of the newspaper come out, and at that point they implemented prior review on the yearbook pages as well, it had to go through administration. So there were 3 more things that got censored that same school year. One article was modeled after the Humans of New York series. It was a first-person account of a student's struggles as a gay teenager, but the message wasn't focused on that. It was just be yourself and confidence and what they learned through those experiences. And the response to that article was, when is it ever appropriate to discuss a student's sexuality? And because I allowed that article to even be written to get to the point where it was reviewed by administration, I, as the journalism advisor, was charged with poor judgment. These students actually took on this censorship directly, and it ended up getting approved. So then my question was, why was I met with such a hostile response when in the end it was approved? Next, my students wrote an article about the dangers of vaping. There was a picture on the cover of a student using dry ice to mimic vape smoke. And although the whole newspaper had been approved by an administrator, once it got printed and was distributed, it was deemed to be inappropriate and, again, poor judgment. And just for the record, I'm not claiming to be a perfect person. I'm not saying that there's things that I couldn't have done better or handled better, or my students could have handled better, but you know, when there is an infraction or an issue or a disagreement, I think that that's an opportunity for a teachable moment for the students, but a discussion with that teacher about expectations or let's not do this again in the future. And instead, I was written up with memos and documentation in my file for poor judgment and insubordination. So in this instance, the cover of the newspaper was very artsy and it was black and white and it had the cool smoke in it from the dry ice, but the claim was that it wasn't clear that this was an article about the dangers of vaping, it was just about vaping in general. And so like I can see in that instance where like a prohibition symbol, the circle with the line through it, over that image would have made it more clear. I think that's a really good example of something that could have easily been fixed with a simple conversation and something that we can look for opportunities to prevent in the future. But instead, it was handled that I, allowing that picture to be used, had poor judgment. So you can imagine at this point in the school year, I was walking on eggshells. I was going to school every day with a stomach ache. I didn't know what was appropriate or expected of me in terms of my job and my duty to my students as their journalism advisor, advocating for them, as well as being my administrator's employee and respecting her directives and trying to walk that line. It was the most uncomfortable season of my life, and I really lived in fear those last couple of months teaching because I felt like anything I do is going to be held against me or twisted in a way that was inappropriate or poor judgment. But we still had newspapers and yearbooks to create. So there was one more issue of the newspaper that went to administration for prior review, and there was an article called Dangerous Games, and it was about the silly little games that preteens and teenagers were playing at the time, like the Tide Pod Challenge and the choking game, and kids were getting seriously hurt and they were dying. Some of them caused deaths in young kids. And so the student wrote an article about what these games are so parents and other students can be aware of them, but not in a way that was to promote them, but to talk about the dangers of them and how these are not okay to play and don't give into peer pressure and students' opinions on them as well. It was a really well done article. It was really well written. It was very balanced and educational, really. And then administration said that, again, it was inappropriate for teenage audiences, even though the kids who were playing these games and dying from them were younger than our demographic even. So after all of those incidents, and there's more to this story, but I just wanted to focus on the parts related to censorship. But just so you know what happened with my situation, I was first given the news that the next school year I would be reassigned from yearbook and newspaper advisor to teaching teen leadership and overseeing in-school suspension. Obviously, I am a passionate journalism educator, and that is not a position that I was interested in, and she was not able to fire me because of the situations that happened, but she can, as building principal, reassign me. So, because I was only certified in journalism, that was the only position that she could place me in. On several occasions, I was told by HR that my job is not in question, and the administrator even said that I am a very good teacher. But a couple weeks later, I was called into her office yet again and met with HR, who told me that my contract was on hold and my decision for renewal was pending, which, if you're not familiar, if you get non-renewed as a teacher, they call it the kiss of death because there's no other district that's going to hire you after you have a non-renewal on your record. And she was able to substantiate holding my contract because of those memos that she had in my file previously about insubordination and poor judgment. So needless to say, despite how much I absolutely loved my job, I loved the school, I loved the community, I loved my kids, I couldn't work there anymore, and I knew that it was time to go. So because at the time I didn't know if I wanted to still be a classroom teacher, I didn't want to risk my contract being non-renewed, and so I resigned before that could happen. So let's talk about New Voices and how that would have helped in this situation. First, let's talk a little bit about what New Voices is. It goes back to 1988, where there was a Supreme Court case, Hazelwood versus Kohlmeyer. That case states that the administration can censor student publications that are school-sponsored if they have a legitimate pedagogical concern, which is a really vague standard and has been used to censor just about everything for the past couple of decades. The censored stories are often things that administrators just don't want to discuss. They are critical of school administration, they might expose some scandal in the school, or they just generally make the school look bad in their opinion. But New Voices legislation protects students from administrative censorship and discipline from trying to write these articles. But also, it actually releases the liability from the administration that if they're held responsible for prior review, either approving or censoring, then they are responsible for community backlash, when if they have no say in it and it's a student publication, the backlash or the opinion of the community falls back on the students, which is a learning opportunity. And then in my situation, it would have protected me as an advisor from dismissal, suspension, discipline, reassignment, transferring, and other types of retaliation. Now, I attended the hearing in Texas when it was up for debate, and so I have some insight into what the common objections are. And I just wanted to address those really quickly because I think that they're very valid and natural responses to what the legislation is trying to do. So first is that we already have the First Amendment. Why do we need this? Yes, the First Amendment absolutely still applies. It still has areas of speech that are unprotected, meaning obscenities, child pornography, defamation, fraud, threats, incitement, fighting words, perjury, blackmail, solicitations of criminal conduct, invasion of privacy, and anything, of course, that violates the law. Those things you cannot write about, and the First Amendment doesn't allow you to. And then also, this is not carte blanche for students to write about whatever they want. Solid journalism education still applies. Your students still have to justify their content decisions and ensure that it is something that is newsworthy and told in an unbiased way. But also, student journalism is a practice environment, and mistakes about judgment should be expected and then used as a teachable moment for why or why not something should or should not be published. And then lastly, all the tenets of responsible journalism still apply. And I realize that that's kind of hard to see if you're not in the journalism world because mainstream media is the way it is right now. The Society for Professional Journalists has a code of ethics that I would give my students every single year, and they would use that as a guide for how to determine what content goes in their publication. Now, if Texas had a New Voices law at the time, I absolutely could have filed an injunction for being retaliated against for defending my students' content decisions and standing up against the censorship. So I share my story for several reasons. One, to demonstrate just how important New Voices legislation is. If you live in a New Voices state, consider yourself very lucky. If you don't live in a state that has New Voices laws, do what you can to learn about the legislation and advocate for it being passed. I think a lot of times journalism advisors don't realize the liability that they carry by producing student publications. It's a super fun job. It's a great experience for students to practice real world skills. You guys know how much I truly love what you do every day. I biasly think that journalism is one of the most important programs in a school. But it's really important that advisors recognize what their students' rights are, how they interact with administration, also build good relationships with the administration to work through these issues and prevent them ahead of time. That can go a long way. Even if you do disagree, if you have a good relationship to fall back on, that can prevent these types of things from happening as well. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I hope that it inspired you to get involved with your state's New Voices legislation and advocate for student press rights to be protected as well as your own. And I hope that you'll join me celebrating the rest of Scholastic Journalism Week. We have a lot of fun stuff coming out on the Organized Advisor email list, so be sure to subscribe there. And please let us know if there's anything we can help you with. Everything we create is directly from advisor requests, so your wish is literally my command. And we love celebrating journalism advisors and their students. Bye!